steps of SIS again. One is become used to doing talks outside SIS, right? And outside Triple S. So it's good to be back here. So I wanted to start by, so this is a proper, I was told this should be like a class. So this is going to be like a class. So I wanted to start actually by telling you that there are many aspects to thinking about the Global South, but today I don't want to lay down the agenda for thinking about the Global South. Because in my opinion, that agenda has been set from Latin America and Africa and South Asia at least a decade, 15 years ago, 2 decades ago. And now we are at the stage where we can actually do it. We can show what it is to think from the Global South. So there are elements to thinking from the Global South. Location is an important element. That is to say, we don't believe that there is a universal abstract position from which we can speak. Location matters, and location is extremely complex. It has to do with time, it has to do with space, it has to do with the different identities you carry in that time and space. So no one speaks from a position that is not located. That's one idea that emerges when you think of the Global South, hence thinking from the Global South. So location is important. The idea of translation becomes very important because we're not, and I don't mean only between different languages of the Global South, but I mean between different conceptual universes. So there's constantly a translation going on. You use the word secular, I use the word secular, France uses the word secular, India uses the word secular. In India, the regime uses the word secular, and the other people, it's the regime versus the rest. So the rest use the word secular. We use it in very different ways, but we're using the same term. So there's translation happening. So these are two of the elements I can place here if we were to think about an agenda for thinking of the Global South and how to speak from. But as I said, I'm simply going to hopefully do it. And I'm going to do it through the idea of justice. What does it mean to think of justice from the Global South? But before I begin, let me begin, not before I begin, I have begun. So let me begin with an astonishing statement, which many of you would have noted, and if you're from SIS, you certainly should have noted, by Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State. A couple of days ago, he was addressing the Munich Security Conference, and he was addressing the European leaders. And I'm going to read some parts of his speech as it was reported in the media. And in fact, this speech was also on US state sites. So this is not, believe it or not, he actually said these words. And he received a rousing applause from the European leaders. So this is some of the paragraphs that I'm going to read to you. This is Marco Rubio. This is the path we ask you here in Europe to join us on. It is a path we have walked together before and hope to walk together again. For 5 centuries before the end of the Second World War, the West had been expanding. Its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers, its explorers, pouring out from its shores to cross oceans, settle new continents, build vast empires extending out across the globe. But in 1945, for the first time since the age of Columbus, it began to contract. Europe was in ruins. Half of it lived behind an iron curtain, and the rest looked like it would soon follow. The great Western empires had entered into terminal decline, accelerated by godless communist revolutions and by anti-colonial uprisings that would transform the world and drape the red hammer and sickle across vast swaths of the map in the years to come. Against that backdrop then, as now, many came to believe that the West's age of dominance had come to an end, and that our future was destined to be a faint and feeble echo of our past. But together, our predecessors recognized that decline was a choice, and it was a choice they refused to make. This is what we did together once before, and this is what President Trump and the United States want to do again together now. You understand what he's saying? But the work of this new alliance should not be focused only on military cooperation and reclaiming the industries of the past. It should also be focused on, together, advancing our mutual interests and new frontiers, unshackling our ingenuity, our creativity, and the dynamic spirit to build a new Western century. Commercial space travel and cutting-edge artificial intelligence, industrial automation, creating a Western supply chain to critical minerals not vulnerable for extortion from other powers, and a unified effort to compete for market share in the economies of the global South, unquote. So if we wanted a clearer statement about what the agenda for the US is, and the fact that he got a rousing standing ovation from the European leaders, tells us how the global South is viewed, tells us that the stories that we used to say, yes, 1945 meant something to us, it was the era of decolonization. Yes, Columbus meant something, it was the beginning of the colonization of the Americas. Yes, the 19th, 18th century meant something, it was the beginning of the colonization of Asia. But Marco Rubio is quite brazenly standing there and saying, we lost it for a while, but we can do it again. So now it's very clear what the agenda is. If we ever thought that the era of colonialism was past with Venezuela and so on, we know exactly what's happening. So it's interesting to see how the idea of global South is being considered here. It's literally like the classes on colonialism you would have studied if you did a BA in political science. Markets, raw materials, it's like that's what the global South is. And you can shamelessly stand there and say colonialism. So in short, what he's saying is colonialism was good. It made Europe and the USA great. The end of colonialism has ruined things for the global North. So let's march right back into the era of undisguised naked imperialism. So this is just a reminder in case you thought we could forget about colonialism as something in the past, or if you thought, and I find this happens on and off among academics, that all this global North, global South doesn't make any sense and there's no need to talk about it. There's a very clear sense in the imperialist map of what is the global North, what is the global South, who deserves to lead, who should be exploited. Through military expansion, it's very clear. Now, of course, I do wonder how the present regime in India that keeps on and on about decolonization can be so sweetly compliant with the colonial powers requirements, but that's another matter. Now, the term global South, as I'm going to use it, and so that's one of the other things that we believe or work with people like us and scholars and students and intellectuals like us. We believe that there are continuing debates inside among ourselves. There are continuing debates. We are not all in agreement on everything. So I'm going to talk about when I use the term global South, there's a very specific way in which I'm using it. It does not refer to a geographical region. I don't mean that I have concocted this idea of the global South. I mean, I'm going to draw on scholarship which sees the global South like this. So the term global South does not refer to a geographical region, nor to a category within a developmentalist discourse. It is intended to indicate a space of thought. That's how we're going to use the term global South here. It indicates a space of thought, the possibility of revaluing and learning from speech that exists on the margins. Now, once you say the global South is not a geographical space just below the equator, it's not that. It's a conceptual idea. It draws from the way the map is drawn and what the global South means, and the way Rubio used the notion of global South. It draws from that. But we are not talking of a geographical space. We want to use it to refer to a space of thought, which means speaking from the margins and learning from speech in the margins. That's the idea. Now, when you conceptualize Global South like this, then we realize that there are spaces within the geographical Global North which are part of the Global South. For example, the thought of African Americans in the United States of America, of indigenous people in the Americas and Australia. And this could also apply then perhaps to some parts of Europe, around the Mediterranean, for example, because the countries of Southern Europe have had long histories connecting them to North Africa, around the Mediterranean. So, and they're also in that sense within Europe, it's seen as less developed than the countries of the north, like Scandinavia, right? So, there are possibly ways in which even parts of Europe, Eastern and Central Europe, for example, and these have histories that cut through neat continental divisions. So to think from the Global South is also to reject the idea that the world is so many continents divided by oceans. Oceans are conduits. Oceans don't separate, oceans connect. And there's a whole field of oceanic studies that shows us that the connections between these, between coastal areas, between all these continents, extend through trade, through conquest, through indentured labor, through slave trade, meaning to say it's not all positive and healthy, the contact, right? But any contact creates a confluence. So there's this term that Ranjit Hoskote and Elijah Trojanov use, confluence, and there's a very lovely book called Confluences, which you might like to read, which says that all culture is produced by confluence. So this is actually important to remember, because one of the things that Rubio says, by the way, that speech is worth reading, really. We should just frame it and hang it up here and there, because it's like you can get things and sell things. So in that speech, he also says that Europe is the source of all culture. We developed X, we did Y, we created knowledge, we had the Enlightenment, etc., etc. And that's also very interesting, because the response to that should not be, no, we had it first. India has existed for millennia like this, and India did everything first. That is not the way we should be thinking about knowledge. Europe has had centuries of connection, and what we think of as European knowledge and the European Enlightenment comes out of connections with Islam and Persian and Arabic and Sanskrit and Pali and Buddhism, and there have been those kinds of connections which have gone on for centuries, and knowledges are produced like this, through contact, through connections. There is no knowledge that is pure, as Aditi said in the beginning. So that's important to remember, that these connections exist. So when I went to go back to the point I was making here, that when we say the Global South is a space of thought, then what happens is that we can also imagine that, or we can also understand that there are spaces in the geographical north. There are spaces that can be called the Global South, because we are thinking of margins, we are thinking of speaking from the margins, we are thinking of learning from the margins. And of course, there is a kind of assumption here when we say Global South there's a kind of, we are setting aside, we are not going into the question of normalized cartography. That is the map that you see, Mercator's projection, with a certain north and a certain south. We can have a whole other discussion and lecture on how that is only one way of representing here. There are multiple map projections. You can turn it upside down. You can Peter's projection makes it look different by showing you the sizes of the land exactly with relative to each other. So there are multiple kinds of map projections, but for now, when we use the term Global South, we are setting aside those discussions. In a way, if you think of knowledge seriously, every space of knowledge has a number of hyperlinks. So we should not be distracted by the hyperlinks at all times. But the hyperlinks are there for you to follow up later. So you might want to think about cartography and the issues of cartography. But for now, we are assuming that map that we all know to be the map. So you have this, you have spaces in the north that could be called the global south. There's also another interesting connection that happens, that there's this hemispheric divide, north and south, but there are links. What happens is there have been historical linkages, both of thought and exchange, between the south and the south within the north. So, for example, Latin American decolonial feminism has found allies in the Latinx feminist tradition of the United States. It can capture a range of identities. Dalit intellectuals in South Asia have been in conversation with black politics and scholarship in the USA from the time of B.R. Ambedkar. He was in correspondence with W.E.B. Du Bois in 1946. At that time, Ambedkar hoped to follow Du Bois in submitting a petition to the UN on the plight of India's, as he then called them, untouchables. So all the way down to the present, there's been this connection between Dalits of India and African Americans. We all know about the Dalit Panther organization, which was founded in 1972, which was explicitly inspired by the Black Panthers of the US. And at its peak for about 5 years, it provided inspiring and militant leadership to young Dalits. Today, activists like Tenmozhi Soundararajan, founder of Equality Labs, who studies the practice of caste discrimination among South Asians in the US, they've made explicit connections between Dalit and Black experiences. So what thinking from the Global South involves is inhabiting and recognizing marginality, heterogeneity, but also solidarities. That's very important, all right? And from this perspective, what does the idea of justice involve? So I'm just going to share some thoughts with you on the idea of justice if we start from what I've outlined so far. So, justice as order. Thank you, I did. Yeah, so let's think about, so there are different ways in which justice is understood. So let's think of justice as order. Often what appears to be just is the normalizing of a previous history of violence. By normalizing, I mean that, well, it's actually, I think, fairly self-explanatory, but it comes from Foucault, the term, but you don't have to go into that. That's another hyperlink you can follow up later. But there is a way in which a situation becomes the norm. So all the questions have to be raised to it. It has to answer all the, meaning to say the normalized thing is what is taken for granted. And any questions you raise against it, you have to answer. It is the burden of proof is on you, right? So that's the power of a normalized framework. So what happens is that when you think of what is just and what is not just, it's often what is just is the normalizing of a previous history of violence which is not visible now. The previous history of violence is not over. You can see nothing is over, right? Listen to Rubio in 2026. Nothing is over and done with. It's all there. It's kind of simmering below the surface. But the surface is just like a thin skin. So the passing on of disadvantage from generation to generation, just as for a handful of others, it's the passing of wealth and privilege from generation to generation. Not to recognize these histories of violence underlying normality is to legitimize a history of violence. So we're thinking of justice as order. Is order something that is necessarily just? So historian Pankaj Jha puts it this way: justice requires us to think like a historian. I found this, he said this in a talk. I found it very, very interesting. Some of you may have been taught by him. He teaches in Delhi University. Justice requires us to think like a historian. That is to say, I understood him to be saying, you don't stop at the now. Now has a history. But history is not just what happened in the past. History is what is happening. History is about the present. It's why do people remember history all the time? Why do people recount histories? It's not because people want to remember what happened in the past that the past becomes important. The talk about the past is actually about wanting to talk about the present in a certain way and talk about the future in a certain way. That's why we have so many different versions of what happened in the past. So when I say history of violence, I'm talking about the here and now, not something that is over and done with. Actually, I can bring it, you can think about it at a very everyday level in terms of a fight you might have with a friend. When you revisit that fight and you say, this is what happened, and she says, that is what happened, you're not interested in what really happened then. You're interested in what's going to happen to this friendship. What is happening to this friendship now? What will it be in the future? You're discussing the past not to fully get what happened in the past. You understand? So that's exactly how history works in a sense, right? That is history is a discipline and there are protocols and all of that. I'm not denying that. But you can understand the logic of saying that the talk about the past is actually about wanting to talk about the present and the future. So when I say history of violence, I'm talking about the here and now, not something that is over and done with. So this is from where I find I keep quoting this. As an old teacher, I'm allowed to keep quoting the same things, and you can say, yeah, I heard her when I took her class the first time. But this is a statement by the French philosopher René Rolland, who said, if order is injustice, then disorder is the beginning of justice. I won't shame myself by asking you to raise your hands if you've heard me say this before. So many times. But look at it, what a stunning statement. How can it not be quoted? I should get a t-shirt with it written on it, right? If order is injustice, then disorder is the beginning of justice. So we need to think about social order more critically, and we need to think about the idea of justice as order more critically. In this context, let me tell you a story about the Nicaraguan Sign Language. I learned about the Nicaraguan Sign Language. First of all, I learned very recently, and this is related to what I'm going to say, recently meaning maybe 5 or 6 years ago, or as recently as that, I learned that sign language is not simply signing English or Malayalam. Sign language is a language in itself. What does it say about my privilege? And what does it say about the circles which I inhabit that I did not know this until 5 or 6 years ago? And I'm living what looks like a reasonably just life. But the fact that I did not know this says something about the levels of privilege that we occupy and the levels to which we are isolated from the margins, right? So I come to know about this, and till now I don't know sign language, and I could learn, I should, I might, but I don't, and I'm not sure many of us do know sign language, right? So, okay, so that's something that I wanted to say on the side, that my ignorance about this tells us how so many aspects of life are invisible to the privileged. Now, what happened in Nicaragua? It's a country, another hyperlink, you can look it up. Nicaragua is a country where a military dictatorship was overthrown by a revolution in 1979. When that revolution took place, there was a huge push towards revolutionizing education. One of the things they decided to do was to start proper sign language teaching. It had been a very isolated society, so the deaf people there had already developed their own language. Unlike any other existing sign language in the world, it was given the name then, once Nicaragua entered the imagination of the world, as Nicaraguan Sign Language. So after the revolution, they started building schools for deaf children to formally educate them. What was interesting, and much has been written about the evolution of the Nicaraguan sign language, and I'll tell you what's interesting for me in the context of justice and order, that so they started building schools for deaf children to formally educate them. What was interesting, they found, was that every year as new students came in, they would pick up the sign language that the senior students and teachers were using, and then they would break the rules. They would introduce new words, new ways of thinking and forming sentences, which would then improve the language. The next batch would break the rules again, and so on, making Nicaraguan Sign Language complex and supple. Nicaraguan Sign Language is understood globally to be absolutely unique in that it is the only language ever to have been created without any other linguistic influences and recorded from its inception. What I learned from this amazing story of the birth and growth of a relatively new language is that rule breaking, what we might call disorder, can be the foundation of new knowledge that reflects the hitherto invisible. Which is to say that I wouldn't like to imagine that all rule breaking leads to knowledge, meaning to say that there are certain protocols of doing history, for example, and if those protocols are not followed, or you should be able to say these are new protocols that we are introducing, and there should be some kind of debate in the community of historians by which the rules change. What I'm trying to say is that there is no one rule of, there's no one principle by which we can think about whether this is genuine knowledge or legitimate knowledge. In some cases, rule breaking might be producing new knowledge, as in this case. In other cases, rule breaking might be actually destroying the very foundation of that knowledge. If you start thinking about certain myths as history, for example, for example, what's happening in a lot of what is happening with Indian knowledge systems, right? This claims that we discovered everything, India discovered everything. So we have to be able to have reasonable and thought out conversations within communities of historians or philosophers or whatever is being discussed. And historians, I don't mean necessarily those with a PhD, I mean those who are educated in history or want to think about history. There should be internal discussions and debates about whether rule breaking in this case is building new knowledge or destroying the knowledge. But rule breaking by itself cannot be dismissed as something that should never be done, which is what I learned from Nicaraguan Sign Language. Because if rule breaking or disorder can be the foundation of new knowledge that reflects the hitherto invisible, I would imagine that reflecting the hitherto invisible is the path to justice. Another account I want to now share with you, which still does relate to justice as order, is a comparison between the French philosopher Jacques Rancière in a particular text of his, and Paulo Freire, who's a Brazilian educationist, was. So Jacques Rancière wrote a book called The Ignorant Schoolmaster. In this book, Rancière tells the story of an actual teacher, Joseph Jacotot, who was sent to teach French to people in a Flemish-speaking area. They knew no French and he knew no Flemish. The teacher had a bilingual translation of the Greek epic Iliad, which had French on one page and Flemish on the other. The teacher gave the children the text and told them to figure out the French words by comparing it with the Flemish section. All the students then learned French and the way Rancière puts it is by having their intelligence revealed to themselves. Now Rancière sees this, it's a very interesting way of reading Jacotot's pedagogy, right? Because Rancière is saying that that people are inherently equal. You don't have to make equality. The teacher and the students are equal. So all that the teacher did, that's why the ignorant schoolmaster, he didn't adopt this. He didn't do what I'm doing. He didn't do this. He gave all the students the book with Flemish and on one side, French on one side, and said, figure it out. And because they could all read Flemish, they figured out the French word for this and the French verb for this and so on. So for Rancière, this is the way of it. This is the way to teach, because you reveal the intelligence to itself. Nobody needs a teacher. That's his point. Now, I'm reading this story from my location, Jacques Rancière, white, global north, French, etc. And I'm same time period, but global south, woman, blah blah. There are multiple elements to our locations. So I'm reading it from a different location. I'm reading it from a formerly colonized country whose languages were thoroughly marginalized. Okay? And I am asking myself why Rancière, a liberal enlightened philosopher, was not asking a simple question: Why was the teacher in a position where the Flemish children had to learn French, but he didn't have to learn Flemish? Why is Rancière taking this for granted? This is about French colonialism. How is it that he doesn't see this? Right? I see it immediately, not because I am more intelligent than him. It's my location. This is what happens when you think from the global south, and that's what happens when you think from the global north. So why was the teacher in a position where the Flemish children had to learn French, but he didn't have to, Jacotot didn't have to learn Flemish? It was because of the way in which the French nation state was created. So this is colonialism, not external colonialism. This is the process of nation building, which many historians have pointed out is a process akin to colonialism. Because especially in Europe, there's this whole producing one language, one culture, that involves marginalizing other languages and cultures and so on. So it's because of the way in which the French nation state was created. All the nation states from the 18th century onwards have been created by marginalizing languages other than the dominant one and assimilating or destroying local cultures. French was the language of the French nation state, and so Flemish, a minority language, had to be pushed aside in favor of French. Why was Rancière not even thinking about this? Because as a Frenchman, he saw this as progress, I imagine. However, irrespective of the specific language, the idea of one nation, one language, or one nation, one anything leads to injustice. What the teacher was doing was one kind of education. It was not education, it was education. But what it was doing was preparing Flemish children to live in a French dominant world which had already taken place around them. This is why many historians have said that the process of creating a modern nation state is similar to colonialism. Now, let's look at Paulo Freire as in contrast. Another way of thinking about teaching is Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. Paulo Freire thought of pedagogy as follows. The teacher teaches the students 5 things, and students teach the teacher 5 things. I draw from this pedagogic method the idea of the outside. He actually gives very interesting examples because he's talking about going into the countryside and teaching. So you have this middle class person going into a village. You can imagine if people like us basically going into a village and teaching, and the teacher asks them 5 questions which have to do with history or English or whatever you're teaching them. And then the students can ask you, what is this leaf? What is the season in which gehu is grown? They can ask you things which you don't know. I don't even know what kind of questions they might ask, right? That's the level of my ignorance. Or what kind of soil is best for cotton? What happens if it rains in June to the crops? Or something, or any other. I'm giving all agriculture related questions, but they might ask anything that they know. Or how would you find your way if you were lost in the dark? How would you find your way home by the stars? Right? They have skills you don't have. They have knowledges that we don't have. So Paulo Freire was drawing our attention to the fact that the teacher teaches 5 things and the student teaches the teacher 5 things. And what I draw from this pedagogic method is the idea of the outside. I find the idea of the outside very productive. If something is normal inside, when the outside breaks in, you suddenly think, this is not fixed, this is not natural, this is not okay. You need the outside to break into the normal space. What I'm calling the outside could be a teacher, it could be a friend, it could be a movement, it could be a book, right? It could be an encounter in a bus. Once that outside enters your normal world could look very different. There is always an outside that stops power formations from being consolidated. So whether it's capitalism, patriarchy, supremacism based on a religious or racial or class identity, there's always an outside that breaks in. This, I think, is what Paulo Freire meant, that the students are this is the way I'm reading him, that the students are the outside of the teacher's knowledge and the teachers are the outside of the student's knowledge. When the outside bursts in, it destabilizes you. It makes you ask, was I wrong all along? And sometimes it would be time to say, yes, I was wrong, but the new world that is revealed is terrible in its injustice that I hadn't seen but wonderful in its possibilities for change. So that is justice as order, and how disorder could be more just. Justice as equality. So the idea of justice as impartial sounds very fair, and that's how we always start, and justice with her eyes bound and all of that, which I've only seen in courtrooms in old Hindi films. I haven't actually ever seen that statue except in the old films set in courts. So we know that justice has to be based on the, see again now when I'm this section, I almost feel I might not have even bothered to discuss it had it not been for the UGC regulations, the equity regulations, and the response to the equity regulations made me realize, just as Rubio made me realize, that nothing is solved. Everything has to be opened up and talked about again. So let's talk about it, right? So justice has to be based on the idea of recognizing differences and recognizing need. This has long been debated in academic circles, but it also rears its head whenever there's a debate on affirmative action, like caste-based reservations, or reserved seats on buses for women, or whatever, any kind of affirmative action. The crux of the matter is the same. Should society recognize differences? Should justice be based on the idea of difference or not? So differences are of at least two kinds. There are differences always, but when they are based on, when those differences produce a hierarchy, that is to say, difference by itself is heterogeneity. That's fine, I think, right? That's what I began by saying, that thinking from the South involves recognizing heterogeneity. But when differences involve, so that's the difference between difference and the kind of difference that we would like to challenge, which is hierarchy-based difference, which is obviously unfair and unjust. So if you think about apartheid in South Africa, for example, which differentiated between races. So difference is not inherently hierarchical, but social structures that produce hierarchy based on difference is something that is unjust. So race, caste, class, and gender differences are also hierarchical. There's nothing wrong with recognizing multiple genders, for example. But if there's a hierarchy that is implied, that's a problem. I also think there's no problem in recognizing multiple castes or multiple race identities. Let there be a proliferation of these identities. But if they're based on hierarchy, or if hierarchy is implied, that's what we are fighting. So that's what's unjust. So if you think about, for example, gender, in the world in which we live, the gender we are assigned at birth determines our entire life and how we live it. And this arises from the functioning of patriarchy, heteronormativity, and the presentation of the world as containing only two sexes. But we now live in a world which has radically changed since the 20th century, a world that Trump and his government are trying to push back, right? We know there are more than two genders. We almost take it for granted now. We do. So they have to pass laws. Think about it. If it's so natural that there are only two sexes, then there are only two sexes. Why do you need to pass a law for that? Do you have to pass a law saying people must breathe? People must drink water when thirsty? No, because that's natural. If you have to pass a law saying there are only two genders, boss, there are many. So I think they should understand this, that the passing of a law to insert something tells us it's not so natural, right? Anyway, so we take it for granted now. We take it for granted now, but even in my lifetime, I grew up reading Simone de Beauvoir, one is not born a woman but becomes one, sex is biology, culture, gender is culture. And then one learned because there was so much queer work, there were movements, there was philosophy, there was Butler, so one just learned, right? And the queer movements and so on right here. So you come to learn these things. And in order to live an ethical life, you cannot say everything I know is correct. We have to say everything I know might change. And it will change every day. Now the problem is not difference, but that difference is inserted into social circumstances that produce hierarchy, as I said. Take a physical disability like blindness. Blindness is a disability because the world is built for sighted people. to be have a disability which doesn't permit you to walk is a disability only because we don't think of how people should move. Look at. I mean, all these ramps were built much later, and there are many parts of JNU which are still not accessible. So the disability is socially produced. The disability is not biological. Has the mic on? Sorry. Okay. So the disability is socially produced. And so there's this small story which also I think many of my students would have heard, and I've said it often, but still I'm going to say it because I have the mic. So one of my friends worked in a research institute, and one of his colleagues is blind, and he dropped in to visit that colleague on a winter evening in Delhi, and it became dark, and they kept chatting, and it became dark, and it became dark, and then my friend who was sighted said, should I just put on, don't you want the light on? So the blind friend laughed and said, if you want the light on, put it on. He didn't need it. Who was disabled in that situation? Right? It was the person who could see in the light. So when there's no light, so you know the sayings like, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king is, to put it politely, BS, right? Because in the land of the blind, it will be fully structured for the blind. There will be no lights. You will have to learn to use your touch. You have to be extremely skilled in listening, your sounds, all of that. And people like us will go blundering in and be completely lost. We will not be king, I can assure you, in the land of the blind. So in this world, which is built for a certain norm of gender, of physicality, that's what creates. So when we are thinking of justice as difference is not the issue. Hierarchy is the issue. Hierarchy based on difference is the issue. And it is also a fact that when the world is built around a dominant norm, then it becomes unjust to others who don't fit that dominant norm. Okay, so my point is that justice has to be based on the idea of equitable treatment. Justice is not about sameness, it's about recognizing differences. And this is, as I said, an old debate in mainstream political theory. Feminists and critical race theorists have produced a strong critique of the idea of justice as sameness. And once again, as with Mandal, as with the opposition to the Mandal reservations, you can see with the UGC equity regulations, the way people who oppose it are talking, it's like they sound like they're talking about the annihilation of caste. They're saying there is absolutely no difference between us, we are all humans. One of them, I heard him say very sincerely, there could be a flat in which there is a Brahmin, one friend is a Brahmin, one friend is Dalit, two friends are OBC, but they all eat together. I really want to see that flat. Please take me to that flat. Seriously, do a survey and see how many such living together circumstances are there in which castes and religions mingle. It's rare, it does happen in, I assume and I hope that people who pass out of JNU, people who pass out of Delhi University, many people would live like that, but it is very, very rare, you know that. So there's a way in which recognizing discrimination is being seen as discrimination. Recognizing caste inequality is being seen as casteism. Recognizing the fact that Muslims are the target of violence is being seen as communal. So there is a way in which the refusing to talk about difference shows up injustice. Now, so when you think about justice in terms of difference, it enables you to think about social justice and affirmative action along the many axes of inequality that exist in the world, and this is from where ideas of redistribution are born. I think there are two more sections. I'll try and do this in 10 minutes. In the next section, I want to think about, so you would see that I'm thinking of justice in different ways. Justice as order, justice as difference, justice and difference. Now I want to think about this idea that this argument that I'm going to make, which obviously again draws on a lot of other people, but I believe that justice can only be post-national. But I'm using the word post-national not in a Habermasian sense. I'll tell you how I'm using it in a minute. So when I say justice can only be post-national, I want to point to the limitations of what Sanjeev Barua calls the homelandist imagination. Sanjeev Barua, writing about the Northeast, calls this the homelandist imagination. And he says that it's there even among counter-nationalist movements. Barua makes an argument for an alternative institutional imagination than this homelandist one. This alternative imagination would disentangle identity from a territorially and ethnically rooted collectivity, because that's what a nation is, right? It's supposed to be, this is the idea of the nation state, that it's supposed to be homogeneous, ethnically, culturally, it's supposed to be homogeneous. That's a homeland. This is my homeland, you're not part of my homeland. So Sanjeev Barua wants to talk about an alternative imagination that would disentangle identity from a territorially and ethnically rooted collectivity. He urges that the ethnic homelands of the region, he's writing about the Northeast, but it has, I think, broader validity. He's saying that he's actually saying that the ethnic homelands of the region be dismantled by giving citizenship rights to the large numbers of so-called illegal immigrants, and more importantly, that the Northeast develop its relationship with its eastern neighbors across international borders. Now you can imagine this is obviously an extremely controversial argument to make today, but it was always a controversial argument, because once nation states came into being, to say anything that might suggest that national borders are not sacred became anti-national, right? But I'm urging us to think about this. What does it mean to think about national borders as not sacrosanct, to think about solidarities and connections across borders? What does it mean to think like that, right? So he's talking about the Northeast, but I feel that an alternative imagination like this is worth thinking about. We need to keep asking these questions. What or who is the illegal immigrant after all? The migrant represents the phenomenon of movement of populations that has been widespread and common across the globe for centuries. That is how humanity has lived. It moves from Africa outward and occupies the rest of the world, and occupies in both senses. It also occupies space, but sometimes it's through violence. As I said, nobody is saying the history of contact and culture has been sweet and gentle and touchy-feely. No, there has been violence, there has been conflict, but new ideas have emerged from those contacts. So the migrant represents a phenomenon of movement of populations that has been widespread and common over the globe for several hundreds of years. This movement has been both voluntary, for example, seafaring traders, pastoral nomads, invading armies that end up settling the lands that they conquer, and it could be forced, slave trade, indentured labor, etc. Once the nation-state system was put firmly in place, however, such movements came under scrutiny from the new homelands. So once the homeland is settled, no more migration, right? From this point onwards, approximately the early 20th century, migration began to be closely linked to the issue of the security of, not people, nation states. The migrant is a threat to the security of the nation state. This idea emerges in the 20th century. Migration began to be linked to this, and Ranabir Samaddar has pointed out that what is called migration is actually a continuation of natural human flows through the centuries, which are suddenly rendered illegal by new national borders. What now require to be called new rights, such as the right to move across national borders for trade or work or for the grazing of animals, right, or fishing, the number of Sri Lankan fisher people in prison in India and the number of Indian fisher people in prison in Sri Lanka because they crossed that border. These are common ways in which somebody's cattle come across a border, they're arrested because they've crossed the border. So these are just everyday ways of living. They predate the nation state. But once the nation state is formed, these forms are rendered illegal overnight. So what Samaddar is saying is that what now required to be called new rights are actually the re-legitimation of old practices. So Mahmood Mamdani makes us quite an interesting claim, and he made this in the 1990s, 1998 or something, contrary to nationalist wisdom, that cultural communities rooted in a common past do not necessarily have a common future. This is the opposite of the idea of the nation state. We have a 4,000-year-old history. We have a 30,000-year-old history. This is the language of nation states. If you think about when you studied European history in school, most of you would have, you've heard of the process called the reunification of Germany and the reunification of France. Now, the idea of reunification is a way of projecting the nation state backwards. It's actually unification. It's the creation of a state. But there's a whole kind of, it's what Nehru writes in Discovery of India, 4,000. So this is the nationalist language, that we share a common past. What Mahmood Mamdani is saying is that even if you do share a common past, which is, it's actually doubtful that there's this 4,000-year-old unbroken history that has existed for any country. It's a very typical European notion. This is a very Western notion that nation states exist. So it's very interesting for me what the current regime and its ideologues pick up as Indian or indigenous, because a lot of it is actually Western ideas. So Mahmood Mamdani says that simply because cultural communities have a common past, even if they do not necessarily have a common future. Political communities should be defined not by a common past, but by the resolve to forge a common future under a single political roof. So he believes that the citizens' rights should be attached to place of labor where they choose to work, not to the accident of the place of birth. This is a very important idea for Africa, because a lot of Africa involves, a lot of people are in migration throughout Africa, and there are the borders were drawn at the Congress of Berlin, and it's all just straight lines which cuts across groups and tribes and so on. So people are constantly in migration, and they have no rights in the place where they work. They have rights in their place of birth where they rarely manage to go back to. So he was making the argument that, and this is in fact, this was the idea of citizenship in, let's say, Europe and the US, which they are trying to turn back. That is, let's say, when all the relatives of Indians go there, and then they become citizens of that country. That's the place where they work, not the place they were born. Right? So, so that's an idea that Mahmood Mamdani was trying to give a philosophical kind of a basis to. So in short, we need to escape the homelandist imaginations that restrict our ethical horizons. It is the homelandist imagination that enables ethno-nationalisms, like the idea that India should be a Hindu nation, or one in which communities that profess faiths other than Brahminical Hinduism, whether Christianity, Islam, or indigenous pre-Aryan faiths, are to be assimilated, marginalized, or exterminated. So any radical transformative politics today must be post-national. In the way this idea has been developed by a group of South Asian scholars, including myself, the post-nationalism is not to be understood in the sense of after, but in the sense of having passed through the nation. So not that nationalism is over, but that we have passed through historically we have passed through the nation-state form. And so in this idea of the post-national, the insistence on an uncompromising critique of the nation is the very obverse of the argument for post-nationalism from above. So we are not, this idea of post-national, which was developed by some South Asian scholars, including myself, it's not about we need one universal world government. It's not that. It is rather, it's a kind of post-nationalism from below, in which you say that there are histories that predate the nation state. And the nation state brings together and makes a closure, whether it's France or India. It makes a closure at a certain point, but the different parts of that nation have histories that, if you take Kerala, for example, Kerala has had, so for Kerala, the West has always been West Asia, not, because that's where it looked out to. That's from where traders have come. That's from where spice trade, etc. So Kerala has always had its independent histories with West Asia. And in fact, J. Devika, the historian of Kerala, one of the historians of Kerala, has actually discussed the cover of a journal at the time of the nationalist movement, where you had Bharat Mata. So this figure was drawn on Kerala. She was called Kerala Mata, and she's lying across Kerala. You all know how Kerala is located, but she's not looking inwards. She's looking out to the sea. That's how Kerala Mata was conceptualized, right? As someone who has connections across the sea, not into this land. Now that's not illegitimate at all. It's another history. And there are multiple things. So that's what Sanjay Baru was saying about the Northeast also. And this is true for all parts of the world. So there's that. So it must be in that sense, under the nation. It must be seen as having two dimensions, over the nation and under the nation. Now, over the nation can also be subversive, because it can interrogate the existence of the nation state. So, for example, cross-border solidarities of feminists across India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or anti-nuclear and peace movements. As recently as 2025, in the conflict between India and Pakistan, amidst that very charged atmosphere, a joint statement calling for peace was issued by over 1,000 feminists of all genders from both countries. And within 2 or 3 days, we had like 5,000, 6,000 signatures. We had to just stop because not 5,000, 6,000, many more. You can find it on Kafila. We had to just stop because we wanted to issue the statement. So that's a kind of post-nationalism which is over the border, but there's a subversive edge to post-nationalism below the nation. Now, when you think about below the nation, it involves claiming histories that run parallel to and do not intersect with that of the nation. When you think of yourself and where you're from, there's a chance that someone like you, who has reached Delhi from many parts of India and apparently from outside India, you would think of yourself as, it's possible you would think of yourself as India. But when you think of India, you're not thinking of an abstract map. You're thinking of your India. You're thinking of your locality. You're thinking of when it rains there. You're thinking of what flowers there. You're thinking of the street food of that area. You're thinking of a location. So for me, Delhi is that. So I will not stand any more nonsense about AQI and I can't breathe. Because when I go to the mountains, I can't breathe. I want my air to have a little substance. So I'm very loyal to Delhi. So when I think about India, for me, it's Delhi. And for example, there's a very lovely interview with Ustad Bismillah Khan, where Shekhar Kapoor is asking him कि आप क्यों नहीं चले गए पाकिस्तान अपनी फैमिली के साथ, और उनका जवाब है, अरे तौबा, हम बनारस छोड़ के जाएंगे, बनारस छोड़ के जाएंगे, right? Banaras is the place. And for him, that, and Ustad Bismillah Khan, a Muslim, I am forced to remind ourselves, thinks of Banaras, which is the heart of Hindu sacred geography, as his home. And this is not just because he's educated. This happened when I went to Gujarat in 2002 after the violence against Muslims. I was in a relief camp. We were trying to do some work. I met this woman, Zubeda. She had a small bangle shop which was destroyed in the riots. And she was just talking to me. And she asked me, so she was not from Gujarat. She said something about I have relatives in Delhi. Then she asked me, Bindravan gayi ho? So she said Bindravan. She didn't say Vrindavan in the proper Sanskrit way. This was the way in which it's said, right, locally. So she said Bindravan gayi ho? And I said nahi. And she said तीरथ करने नहीं गई. हम वहीं से हैं. हमारा वतन वही है. These are the words I remember very clearly from 2002. Vatan, her homeland, was in a place that is associated with Hindu pilgrimage. She assumed I might have gone there, but also she knew I might have gone there. Tirath karne nahi gayi. So the idea of justice being post-national involves respecting locality, respecting the way in which that because patriotism this is what patriotism involves, which is called anti-nationalist, right? Because nationalism is based on an abstract notion of a landmass, hatred for most of its people. Apparently, that's very important to be a nationalist. You have to hate a hell of a lot of people. And for a constantly produced other, right? And militarism. These are the aspects of nationalism. Put a tank in a university so that students will become nationalists. Right? Get army and armed forces officers to address students. It has happened in this building, and it has happened in Delhi University, where military officers address students to teach them nationalism. So that's nationalism. But patriotism is not that. Patriotism is about love. I'm sorry to use this very ghisa-pita word, but it means something to most of us even today. Century idea. But I think patriotism involves love of people, love of the heterogeneity of the localities, love for justice and equality. And I keep wondering how this regime and its ideologues keep using this term, this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. If I hear it one more time, I might actually faint. The entire world is one family is what it means. How does it square with your extreme hatred of minorities, with your extreme hatred of migrants? If the entire world is one family, then let the migrants stay. But, no, but they are right. Because they are thinking of the actual family. The heterosexual, patriarchal, violent, misogynist, casteist family. Yes, that is the nation. That is right. They are not making the mistake, we are making the mistake. So the post-national involves a recognition and valuing of, I think, multiple histories and identities. I have a last section called Justice is Anti-Capitalist, but I can stop and we can come back to that if there are questions, because